it's just like this wave washing over me again and again. It knocks me down, and when I try to stand up, it just comes for me again. And I can't. It's just gonna drown me.
Hello.
Hello, we're back with episode 2 of our series on superheroes and disability.
I'm Kayla,
I'm Serena.
and today we'll be talking about Wanda Maximoff, aka the notorious Scarlet Witch. So first we're going to get into who is Wanda anyway?
Her story is so much more muddled and confusing and just less well known than Steve's, so we think it's important that we start with just laying out the details of who she is, why she is, her origin story in the movies in particular, which is what we're looking at and analyzing, and also just what makes her different from Steve.
Right. So where should we start here? Should we get into kind of her origin, which is listed in Age of Ultron?
Yeah, let's talk about her first appearance in
Okay.
the Marvel cinematic universe,
Right.
which is in the Age of Ultron,
Yeah.
as a villain along with her twin, Pietro.
Yes, Aaron Taylor Johnson, who, sorry, I just gotta shout that out. But yes, so we first see them, and I actually think it's as a post-credit scene. For
Oh yeah, that's their first appearance. In
yeah,
a
post-credit scene. I think
for
it's in
Winter Soldier.
Winter Soldier, yeah. And they're in like cages.
They're in two like adjacent cells.
Cells, yeah.
It's a very ominous lighting.
And they're like practicing. I wouldn't say practicing, but they're super powered. They're
it seems like they can't control it yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's sort of like they just got their powers and they seem like wild, kind of uncontrollable.
Right. And then we see them in Age of Ultron, and they're kind of, I wouldn't say the main villains, but they are definitely villainous, antagonistic in this film, and the Avengers essentially have to stop them. Honestly, more so Wanda than Pietro, but you know. But yeah, they have to do that until finally they kind of join forces to take down Ultron. And I think from there is where we really start to see and understand Wanda. So they lost their parents because of like some Stark tech.
Yeah. I believe that Wanda and her twin brother hid under a bed watching. This is after their parents were already killed during a bombing. And the two of them hid under a bed looking at a bomb that was going to set off, or they thought was going to set off, and it had the Stark Industries logo on it. So Wanda has this very traumatic memory of just staring at the Stark logo for like, I think it was like almost days, and waiting to die, essentially.
Right. And then they kind of volunteer. They become like activists of sorts for like their community for a while, but then they do volunteer to kind of be experimented on.
Yeah. And by the way, the activists and kind of the things that Wanda and Pietro are saying when they work for Ultron, like, oh, we want the Avengers to be gone. Like, we think they're too dangerous. We think they inflict like harm all over the world. They just do whatever they want, essentially. It's kind of valid, and it's basically what they will say in like the Sokovia Accords in Civil War, except coming from below. Like, these are two kids who actually did suffer from sort of like the unrestrained power of Tony Stark and the Avengers, and of like the American Empire in general.
Yeah, kind of like this uncheckedness about it. But so they, volunteer to kind of get experimented on. Pietro gets super speed when she's Quicksilver, and Wanda gets her powers kind of derived from the Mind Stone.
Like telekinesis.
They basically describe it as kind of like warping reality too. And like, I think actually like in comics it's like warping reality and also like probability of sorts. And so she can just make anything whatever she wants, essentially. Like in like basic terms. She's very, very powerful. Like there's very little that she can't do.
And I think what's interesting here is that the way they're first introduced in Age of Ultron, before the Avengers ever actually like come face to face with them, Maria Hill says that there's two of them, and basically he's fast and she's weird. And I think that use of weird and sort of like this comes to define how Wanda is seen and treated, and like presumed to be throughout that film and the following films.
Yeah, and I think that weird kind of goes along with the fact that she can't be defined by one ability, essentially. Because it's like you can easily say like, oh, he's super fast and that's what his thing is, but like hers, like part of what is kind of defines her is like how unknown her power is and like how grand it is, and like nobody knows.
Like, it kind of reminds me
what she can do
of like the Matt Murdock video. Of like, oh my god, like I have no idea what you can do. Like, are you reading my like heartbeat right now? You know all of these things, and I think that's how Wanda gets treated. And that's one of the things
they're scared of.
Yeah, that's one of the things we want to talk about in this episode of how like physical disabilities, especially those that are visible, such as being in a wheelchair, versus these like mental disabilities, like Pietro, you can see that he's fast when he uses his power, but if Wanda's just like sitting across from you looking like a regular person, is she reading your mind? I don't know.
And I think, oh well, yeah, also like from there they kind of join the team, they help the Avengers out, but Pietro dies. That's another kind of like loss for Wanda. And but she's still a part of like the Avengers, but more as like a probationary thing. Like it's very like checked. She'll get very little like agency, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but like within this group, and she like very like little freedom of like movement. Literally, like she's confined to the Avengers compound. So we kind of like see her there in Civil War, and then we see her again in Infinity War, where she kind of like has this she's kind of deemed stable enough to at least be on her own with Vision. And so they kind of like
with Vision,
which is still kind of monitoring
like a
her.
synthetic humanoid who is more trustworthy than she is.
So then she's with them or with him in I don't know, some like European country. Until they're like called, or until like they need like help because like Vision's being targeted for his mind stone.
The stone in his head.
Yes. And it is the mind stone. And then yes, she helps out, but because in her kind of version of helping out is she has to kill Vision to basically save the universe.
By the way, Vision is her boyfriend, in case you did not know.
She has to kill Vision. She does it, and then Thanos rewinds time, and she killed
her boyfriend
essentially for
no
nothing.
Reason. Yeah,
essentially for nothing. And then she watches him die again at the hand of Thanos. And with all this trauma, and with very little help from her teammates, which is like literally all of the Avengers.
Like
there's so many members.
Help.
She creates Westview, where she essentially kind of mind controls the entire town, city, whatever.
Suburban town.
Suburban town, and she creates her own reality where Vision is still alive, where she has kids, and then she finds out that she has to lose them again, and that they're really not real, and in order to do what's better for the greater good, essentially with that town that she's putting through a lot of pain and kind of torment, essentially, she has to let go of like the only people that she like still has and like loves and stuff, and she has to kind of like deal with that loss. And then it kind of picks up where Doctor Strange is, but we're not going to get into that for spoiler reasons.
Watch it in theaters right now.
But it does connect a lot to
or don't watch it.
It does connect a lot to what we're going to be talking about. But essentially that's kind of like her back, or that's how we kind of like see her throughout the MCU so
and the
far.
way you just like laid it out, I actually like am more sad for her now. Like the way you just laid it all out. Like she was really introduced in Ultron as a teenager. It wasn't really confirmed, but like people guess she would have been around like 16 or 17. So she was still like fresh from a childhood of like war trauma. And then she loses her twin brother, who, by the way, she like feels him die because they're connected by like her powers. And then in like a couple, I think the time frame to her would have felt like only a year or two, like essentially a few years, she loses vision again. And the only people, since she doesn't have her parents, like her boyfriend, her twin anymore, no family, are the Avengers around her who, like you said, like using the word probation is so interesting. I've never thought of that before, but she really does join the Avengers under this sort of like understanding that they're sort of checking her, policing her essentially. Like she's not free to do whatever, they're watching her.
It's kind of like her whole like history out the MCU is mapped by loss. What has she lost in this point that has gotten her from like point A to point B? Okay, and then what loss is she experiencing at point B? Okay, well that's gonna take her to point C where she experiences another loss. So that's kind of like how it's mapped out. And honestly, this isn't unique to just the MCU. We see this in the comics. Like she does experience a lot of loss in the comics as well. But I think to see it in such a linear and visual way, not that comics aren't, but like you know how like sometimes comics can kind of be a little bit all over the place. To see it in such a linear way, and sometimes it can be very sequential, like the next project we see her dealing with something, and it's just like wow, like she really doesn't like get a break from any of that.
The other difference, there are a lot of differences between Wanda's story and her in the MCU and her story in the comics, which goes for most of the heroes pretty much, but hers are pretty extreme. She has a very complicated storyline in the comics. Like you said, like lots of people write the comics, like sometimes it changes, sometimes it's contradictory. But it's interesting the sort of narrative that the writers of the movies extracted or pulled out from that like wealth of comic lore essentially, and they came out with this like very basic, very simple storyline, and they also completely erase her Jewish and Romani background in the comics. Like her parents were Holocaust survivors, and in the movies they were like, let's have her join a neo-Nazi experiment.
And like the Roma people are like a marginalized ethnic group, so it's just like when it's like, hey, we're going to not the like, I don't know, to change that and then make it where she's like Eastern European, and she's
like they're kind of hinting at it
just a little bit, but not like fully getting there. And then she like willingly volunteers for like a neo-Nazi like experiment, when it's like you just like essentially, I think thinking about it alone it's kind of like, okay, that's a little bit like murky, like how we're gonna think about it. But when you compare it to like her actual like history and like her origins within the comics of like those deep ties to like those Jewish and like Romanian like roots, and it's like, wow, like her parents were Holocaust survivors, but you're gonna have her like do these Nazi experiments.
And I also think it might just like, be like, maybe if they're like, oh, she's from Sokovia, like this Eastern European country we made up, it would be less like obviously bad for Marvel to like treat her as evil for just trying to fight for her like own community, for her own freedom essentially. Like if they're like, yeah, she's Roma and Jewish and she's pissed at the Avengers because they like murdered her family, that would not go over so well.
It wouldn't. And I think what's interesting is like in the comics, like they actively explore her and her brother's like heritage. They address some of like the Roma racism that is like prevalent. They talk about this stuff, and there was a lot of controversy around you know, Elizabeth kind of getting casted, a white blonde woman, especially someone who has used terms like that can be seen by Romani people as kind of like a slur. So it's just like, why would you kind of like cast her as this? This is kind of like not a little off topic, but we definitely just wanted to acknowledge kind of this whitewashing a little bit with the character, especially since like it seems like her ideal place, we kind of talked about this idea of like utopia in the last episode, but her kind of ideal being is this like white
her version
suburban
of Utopia
mom
in New Jersey,
in New
Westview
Jersey,
in New Jersey.
and it's just like it's not
so
yeah, and like we talked about, also the idea of like Steve being this blonde, blue-eyed white man, and now we're kind of getting a similar. I mean, he was already originally written like that, but to kind of have it something like this again was such a complex character, and someone who had like this rich kind of like heritage and like background that were kind of quote unquote simplifying, and I don't know.
Yeah, to me, like, I'm sure there are many reasons why Marvel decided to like completely elide like her Romani Jewish heritage. But for me, I think one of them is just so that they can more easily kind of like sell this idea that like she wants to join the Avengers, and then she wants to like live in New Jersey and live in like a house with like a picket fence and all of this stuff without like coming across as obviously problematic. Like if they're like, here is a Romani Jewish woman who like essentially fought back against like the West, for really like bombing her home community, like killing her parents, all of these things, like an anti-imperialist icon, honestly. But because they completely erased her history, we are like less sympathetic or less aware of the sort of dynamics at play, so it's easy for us to like forget the actual reasoning behind why she does what she does, and it's easier to sort of like sell this like, oh, she's just like unstable.
Right. She's a lot more justified, I would say, in the comics for like what she does and everything, even though like once again like Wanda and mental illness and mental health has never been like a disparate thing, like not in the MCU and definitely not in the comics, and she definitely still struggles with depression in the comics, but it's addressed a lot more, it's talked about a lot more, and you kind of get how her background and her heritage and everything that she's gone through like tying into that.
Like they understand her as a victim of lots of trauma and like intergenerational trauma, and
it's just not quite the same in the MCU. And one of the things we kind of noticed is how well her powers are kind of like used as like a tool essentially throughout all the movies to kind of benefit the Avengers. Because I mean, we talked about how she essentially becomes a part of the team, and she's hands down like the most powerful like member, but like member is even like in quotes to be honest. Like
powerful is kind of in quotes too, because she's the most powerful, like she has the most like blasty damage, I guess, but she makes none of the decisions.
Yeah, she doesn't. Like it's very much when they decide it's the right time for her to act and really like harness her power and use it against the like enemies, whatever, like then she's praised, she's like thanks for looking out essentially, right? But then when it's like she kind of uses it on her own like volition, it's like no, I don't think this is good. So
for even like the big oh no moment, right? That at the beginning of Civil War that sets off the Sokovia Accords thing. Like it's like when she makes a decision on her own, even with the best of intentions, which was to save Steve's life, if it goes wrong, she gets punished for it, and it does start to kind of feel like she just gets punished for like exercising her own judgment, even if like the girl's trying her best.
That like felt really bad, and at least in that part I will say Steve had her back. Out of like everyone kind of in the Avengers, Steve had her back, and I think that just comes with the fact of like Steve is morally
like whatever we said about him being a good man, he is a good man.
Yeah, like he genuinely is. Like he has that kind of like moral compass always pointed. What is it, like north? Is that the phrase or something like that?
Just in the right direction.
Whatever, in the right direction.
We approve.
Right. So like he did have her back, but once again, like this is not kind of, I guess, pardoning Steve in a lot of ways, because it feels like he's there when it is a little bit more convenient for him. But he definitely is the one who kind of understands her a little bit more before Vision kind of steps in and assumes that role. But yeah, so like I think, for example, during that time where I think she kills like 16 people in Lagos when she tries to save Steve because of an explosion. And
an explosion that she was trying to contain and
she was
redirect.
trying to contain, but she really wasn't able to, or at least in the way that needed to be contained.
Which isn't the Avengers' job supposed to be to train her? No one's taking responsibility for oh shit, maybe we didn't train Wanda well enough.
Right, and so she kills these people, and it's all over the news. That's kind of what most people are talking about, and she's really down. Obviously, she's dealing with the fact that the burden of she just killed so many people, obviously. And Steve's kind of just well, think about it this way. Sometimes there are casualties, and if we don't step in, a lot more people will die. And on the surface, this is kind of old man wisdom, right? But I think when you think about it a little bit more, I feel like if I was in Wanda's situation, that's not something I would necessarily want to hear. I think in moments like that, I would want my grief and my trauma essentially to be acknowledged and validated. Yeah. I would want to because it very much felt hey, kind of dust yourself off. It's okay. These things happen and they're going to happen. But at the same time, you have to think about how we're saving the greater good. And I get that to a certain extent. But also, Steve has been living for 100 years. She has not. She's still very young.
Also, he's Captain America. He's the white man who cannot do anything wrong. The way you just put it, I've never thought of it before, but that's terrible advice from Steve because it goes from him, right? Moment. But it doesn't go for Wanda. Steve will be excused if he makes some decisions for the greater good that lead to some casualties. Well, that's Captain America's call.
Even thinking about Bucky, you know what I mean?
Oh my god.
Even not necessarily Bucky and all his kind of, that's a whole other thing, but all his crimes against humanity essentially. But thinking about all the things Steve is willing to sacrifice for Bucky, and it's always still perceived as he's in the right.
At least he's trying his best.
At least trying his best.
He has good intentions.
It's his brother essentially. This is the only person he has from the time that the time when he was young and all of that stuff. And you think about it that way, and it's you know what? Yes, he is splitting up the Avengers, but he's doing it for his long-term bestie. Right?
Yeah.
Wanda does it to actually save someone who is partially the reason, the team who is partially the reason for her brother's death. A man who, you know what I mean? She's she's making these sacrifices for a person that she doesn't know super well, but she trusts to a certain extent. And she's literally labeled a weapon of mass destruction, which we will actually show a clip of right now, where basically Steve is fighting Tony. Because Tony wants to keep her confined in the Avengers Tower, and it's she's not. He phrases it as kind of the outside world is kind of not safe for her. But then Steve is "Are you sure that's what you mean?" And yeah, Tony kind of calls her a weapon of mass destruction. So we're gonna look at that really quick.
That's from Civil War, by the way,
yes,
in case
Civil
you
War.
Couldn't gather from the context.
Once we put out the PR fire, these documents can be amended. I'd file a motion to have you and Wanda reinstated.
Wanda? What about Wanda?
She's fine. She's confined to the compound currently. Vision's keeping her company.
Oh, God, Tony, every time I think
what,
you
it's
see
100
things the right
acres
way.
with a lap pool. It's got a screening room. There's worse ways to protect people.
Protection. Is that how you see this? This is protection? It's internment,
She's
Tony.
not a U.S. citizen, and they don't grant visas to weapons of mass destruction.
She's a kid.
Give me a break! I'm doing what has to be done to stave off something worse.
You keep telling yourself that.
Yeah, pretty rough.
And also just that Steve and Tony are arguing over this, just two white men, one who is responsible for her parents' murder.
Yeah,
oh my god.
And this ties into this agency that we're talking about, and this kind of brings in gender in a lot of ways, because what we're gonna kind of talk about a little bit right now is not necessarily super unique to Wanda's story and Wanda's portrayal in the MCU, as it's seen kind of with characters like Black Widow and Natasha, sorry, and like Sharon Carter, especially in Civil War. But a lot of what they do is very dependent on the men.
Right, it's like
the
accessory to
right, and they don't get a lot of exploration or like storylines unless it kind of is connected to a main kind of man in the story, and a lot of times it's Steve.
But what like makes Wanda a little different, and what is really interesting about her sort of like perceived unstable mind is that like she's sort of perceived as having a lot of agency because she's so dangerous and powerful. But Tony's actually getting at something, calling her a weapon of mass destruction, because weapons do not fire themselves, right? Like somebody's using the weapon. Like even throughout Civil War, like she gets put under like house arrest by Tony, and then Clint, who's someone else who's seen as like one of the few people to sort of like care for Wanda like empathetically. But Clint comes to like essentially which is essentially recruiting her to fight for Team Cap. So again, like using her as a weapon. So
and thinking about like it all, so we kind of have it listed as like, well, initially she's trapped by Tony, she's guarded by Vision, she's freed by Clint, and then used as kind of like a weapon on Cap's team. So it's like all these things are just kind of like they're all controlled by men like in the movies, and she's just restricted so much, and
at the end she's the one who's like in the straight jacket, like in like a shock collar. And visually that tells us that she's the most dangerous one there in Team Cap that's like locked up.
She's not even on the same floor as like the same level as the rest. So you see like Ant-Man and you see Ant-Man, and then you see Sam Wilson on the same floor. They're able to walk around. They're right next to each other. They can talk to each other if they wanted. Wanda is held on a completely different floor. She's in a straitjacket. She's in an electroshock collar. Like it's just like completely like isolated, and she is just as quote unquote accountable as the rest of her teammates. Yet like she's punished a lot more for her actions, even if it was something that was driven like that wasn't really even like motivated by her. Like honestly, what motivation does she have to help Bucky? She doesn't know that man. Like, you know what I mean? She doesn't know that man. Like, but you know, she chose it because she was like, well, at least Steve kind of sees me as someone who
like
can
a person.
be free. So it's like it's one of those things where it's like the bare minimum I will accept. And it's just like, but at the end of the day, look what happens to her.
Yeah, and what's like so malicious about this is like she always gets portrayed as so like as the most dangerous, as the most powerful, just because of her sort of like abnormal, like inscrutable, unknowable abilities and her unstable mind, her mental illness essentially. When in reality, like we laid out, she has no agency throughout the movie. Like she's just a pawn in all of these like men's games, and the men who have a lot of agency make a lot of like silly mistakes. But she at the end is the one who's like portrayed as like the most powerful. Like her decisions, her actions are the most consequential.
And I think a big part of that, we kind of said a little bit earlier, like power is put into quotes, just because we notice that a lot of her power is rooted in loss and grief and trauma. And I was watching this video essay, and they mentioned how the video essay is called Beyond Madness, Understanding Wanda Maximoff, Mental Illness, Memory, and Grief. And they mentioned that she is a woman who is most dangerous when she is vulnerable. Her trauma is both her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. And we kind of talked about, if you just binge watch like just a bunch of like Marvel Wanda content, right? You see that when she has those like blasts of like those surges of power, it's all because of what she's losing in that moment. And when she goes on that like 1v1 with Thanos, she's like, you have taken everything from me. Like it's all rooted in what she has lost, and it's all rooted in her trauma and her grief. But like it's uncontrollable because her mental state is very like unstable. But that's also partially because she's not being tended to at all by like any of like these people, and if she grows close to someone, they lose it. And I think it's just kind of like BS essentially.
Yeah.
Is that, and for me, I wasn't like the biggest like Wanda stan, to be honest, because
I was.
I've grown to like throughout this whole thing, I've grown to like her, appreciate her, sorry, a little bit more. But initially I wasn't the biggest fan of her because I felt like here we go again. She's kind of like going through, she loses someone and then she's powerful, and it was like and it wasn't necessarily her fault. It was kind of, I was seeing it from like, I don't like that they keep using depression, trauma, grief as a plot device to make her stronger. It was more from looking at it in that point of view, not as not liking the character, but what they were doing with her that was really annoying me. Because it's like, that shouldn't be the only time we see her strong and like defeat these like all powerful kind of beings. Like, that shouldn't be the case, especially when she's not being cared for in the in-betweens. And it's like, let's just keep hurting her because that's what makes her stronger, and then that's when we can use her. And it's just like, it was like very frustrating for me in the beginning, but I didn't know why, because I didn't have this kind of like context back then when I was first being introduced to her. But like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying too, like that is sort of, that relies on our kind of assumption that people who are displaying signs, like obvious signs of mental illness, are more likely to be violent.
Right.
Like, it's basically like drawing from like our ableist notions of what mental illness looks like, what happens when people are grieving, when people have PTSD, and they're really just using that and reinforcing that trope with Wanda.
Right. Yeah, and it's very interesting because this also brings up another conversation of like the intersection between kind of mental illness and disability. And I think there are those crossovers, and in this case we do see it with her because her mental illness is disabling. Like, while it might not be, physically disabling, it is emotionally and mentally disabling for her.
Yeah, and it's also what gives other characters the reason to take away her agency.
Right, to villainize her.
Yeah, basically. So this is why we think she's such a useful contrast to Steve.
Yeah.
Because if Steve's superpower is about having this like perfect, super normal body, Wanda is all about having these really weird, abnormal abilities that no one can fully understand, and an unstable mind that makes her untrustworthy. It makes her and these sort of like powered abilities she has dangerous because no one really understands how they work.
Right.
No one can predict it. So for Steve, his powers kind of like cure him or like bring him to a level of perfection.
Right.
Whereas Wanda, her powers disable her, like you said. They make her dangerous, they make her unwanted, they make her not more than human or like superhuman, but inhuman.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we kind of like want to keep tying in is this idea of audience perception as well. So in the last episode we kind of talked about fan works, and while that is kind of like a big thing for Wanda, if you look at like some of the tags on like AO3, for example, it's a lot of angst, it's a lot of
hurt,
PTSD, like hurt, comfort, all that stuff. But the biggest thing we kind of wanted to talk about here in terms of audience perception is just how ambiguous kind of it can be sometimes. You have like, it's such on the opposite end. You kind of have people who are like, I will support her no matter what. I will support her even if she is the main villain of every fucking movie, because they kind of like see a little bit like she's like lost so much and they like feel for her. And also, let's bow down to like a powerful ass woman, right? But at the same time, you do get other people. It's like, she literally enslaved a whole community and no one's saying anything about that. But you have kind of like people, I don't know, you have people like Loki or something like that. I don't even want to bring in
Bucky, like we said
Bucky
earlier.
Yeah, you have people like Bucky, and some people are just not as like forgiving when it comes to that. And that's kind of, that argument's interesting.
I think part of it with Wanda is that people, because there's sort of this like presumption that she's unstable, they actually like produce her as as an inherently dangerous or inherently unpredictable and irrational person. Whereas for like Bucky or Loki, like people like literally bend over backwards to be like, well, Loki has like daddy issues or whatever, and Bucky like has gone through so much, all of this.
Right.
But with Wanda, they can just be like, well, she's crazy, she's weird, and therefore we won't bother to like explain why she does things. We're just gonna assume it's irrational.
I think part of that is on the fault of like some of the writers for the MCU in the sense that like they go out of their way to make, and this is one of the downfalls of the MCU, like I know a lot of fans say, is that they're not really good with their villains, and I think
or their women
but like in this point I'm gonna make it, it's mostly like the villains, because a lot of what they try to do is make them redeemable. And so far we've been introduced to a lot of male villains, right? You have Loki, you have the Winter Soldier, you have, I don't know like who else, but like those are the ones that are sticking out to me right now. But Marvel loves to make redeemable villains where it's like, hey, they're kind of like justified in what they're doing in terms of like they kind of have like good intentions, or like something just bad happened to them, and so that kind of explains why they're doing what they're doing. And you see that with people like you do see that with like even like some of the like female like villains, like I forget her name from Falcon and Winter Soldier, where she's like, hey, a lot of us have been just like forgotten.
That's one of the worst ones, honestly, because she had a good point.
Yeah, but so like you have that, and like Wanda's one of those people. Like she is like redeemable in a way, but because Marvel kind of like plays hot potato with her character sometimes, and like, hey, this movie she's kind of antagonistic. This one, let's feel bad for her a little bit. Let's explore her backstory a little bit more. This one, let's have her doing something that's even more malicious. And so I think because they keep going like back and forth with her, people are confused. They don't know what to think about her sometimes, where it's like Loki had one, maybe two bad movies, you know, in terms of like Avengers, and then in like Thor, but usually by the end of that he's forgiven.
Also, he's like just like the best part of even the bad movies.
Right. And then you have like someone like Bucky, he was literally just the Winter Soldier and evil for one movie. And then it's like, hey, but he's just a really traumatized guy. So it's like they're not quote unquote evil for long. Wanda, she has more time being kind of antagonistic.
Right, because it's seen as a condition for her. It's seen as a disability, a mental illness, not like, oh, something happened.
Something happened to her, even though a lot of like these like PTSD, depression, and like the things that she is like struggling with is triggered by the trauma and the loss and the grief and like what's happened to her. But I feel like it's not really that connection sometimes is like not being made, at least like but like obviously it's the people who do support Wanda see this. Like we're not saying that nobody sees this at all and this is not recognized, because you know when I saw Doctor Strange, there were a lot of like full on Wanda supporters where it's like, but you know, she's justified a little bit, you know, like just trying to see kind of, I don't even want to say her point of view, because it's not even like a perspectives type thing.
Right, just looking at like what Marvel does with her character and what audiences do with her character from a critical perspective, I think is important. And also just the other thing is that those villains at least all are given like, except for maybe Loki, like given some kind of like noble aspiration, right? Like they're not just looking out for themselves. So even if they have like the right idea about the world, like, oh, maybe humans are kind of bad. Like Ultron was kind of onto something with that.
Even with Thanos, like he's guys, the universe is overpopulated. We're not going to have enough resources. My planet literally died because it was overpopulated, and this is going to happen to millions and billions of planets all throughout the universe if we don't. And obviously you're just kind of like, well, couldn't you just use the resources or like use the like snap to kind of give more resources instead of whatever? But at the same time, it's like I knew a lot of like I talked with a lot of Thanos supporters. They were like, low key supporters. They were like, low key, he has a point. Like, you know what I mean?
Thanos supporters.
But like some people were like, yeah, he kind of has a point. But even with Thanos and like seeing that moment like with Gamora, Like,
Mm-hmm.
and to see him cry, you're just like,
A human.
dang, am I supposed to feel bad for him now? But I feel like,
yeah, like that's supposed to humanize him,
Yeah.
right? But like with
Yeah.
Wanda, all her like she's commonly seen as selfish because of this.
Yeah.
Like she just does things because she's sad or something, or because she lost
Right.
something. But again, this is just all going back to like perceptions of mental illness and
versus physical disabilities.
right.
Yeah. And it's just like you said a little bit earlier, it's very much tied to what are like kind of already set. No, I don't want to say set in stone, but our perceptions,
like
normalized
or,
ideas of mental illness. Like when you automatically associate them with violence, with killers, with villains, with like all of that, and a lot of times it's solely used as a justification. Like, hey, they're doing this terrible thing because they have a mental illness, and it's just kind of wrapped up like that. And so when you have someone like Wanda, who, like I said, they do not dissociate her from her mental health and her mental illness, they make it very apparent, whether it's being addressed in universe or not. Everyone knows that she struggles with like her mental health. You already kind of have those perceptions of her being at least slightly antagonistic, and we see that with how they commonly portray her throughout the MCU.
Yeah, and I think like she continuously is portrayed as not just like dangerous and kind of unwanted, but also like unknowable. Like you can't predict what she's going to do. You can't understand why she does things. And I think that just really like perpetuates the idea that disability is something that's like deviant, it's undesirable, it's inscrutable, like you just don't want it there.
Right. And so I think Doctor Strange, the second movie, it touches a lot on this, and it's honestly like it could be a second WandaVision, essentially, a very much case study on her kind of mental state. We won't talk about it, but I will just say it does a lot of those themes kind of connect to what we're talking about here, and how you kind of see that her kind of like teeter the line of, being morally justified, or is she kind of being too selfish and succumbing to her mental illness and her trauma, and does that just put her in the wrong? So that's
yeah. Well, also, what about WandaVision? Because in some ways, I think
that talked about it too.
Yeah, I think it could be seen as a study on Wanda's grief and on her PTSD.
Yeah.
But like, what do we think? Do we think it did a good job of that?
I think it's so, I never know how to feel, because I will say I'm not one of those like blindly follow Wanda through everything, especially after Doctor Strange. But like through all this, I feel like I understand her so much more. And I think here's the thing: when it comes in conversation to Wanda, it can't just be like, is she good or is she bad? We have to take into account that she's just inherently an ambiguous kind of character. And in that sense, I think the show was successful in encapsulating that, because you understand her a lot more and you see where she's coming from. You're like, let her have something. Like, you're kind of rooting for her in a way, especially when Sword comes into play. You're not rooting against her in that show. For the most part, you're not rooting against her. But at the same time, you are also like, hun, we can't enslave people now. Like, we can't do that. And it's like, we understand what you're going through and all of that, and we kind of see new clips on her kind of describing like her depression and where she is mentally. But it's just like, this doesn't necessarily justify or completely justify like what you're doing. So I think in kind of showing both sides of it, and not just having her solely as the villain for that, even though she is doing something like not great, I feel like it kind of encapsulates that kind of ambiguous nature At least to me. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree, but
I don't know either. I think Marvel really fumbled
yeah.
the last
She's
couple of
confused.
episodes.
Yeah.
I think the first few were much better, and I did not think that it was going to end that way. You know, all like the theories that were like flying around about what was going on in Westview.
Yeah.
I really hated the one that Marvel chose, essentially. Like I thought other things were involved, not just like Wanda was like one day woke up and was like, "Let me mind control a whole town. That will make me feel better," which is a really
well. It didn't. They made it seem like it wasn't a conscious decision, but they didn't. Like it was like we saw like she saw the home and it was destroyed and kind of
right. Like again, it's like another surge
out, and it kind of happened to be this way, right? So it didn't even seem like she was like, hey, I'm going to do this and this is what I'm doing. But at this, and she also didn't realize that she was hurting other people as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it all just kind of goes back to like them. Like I don't know if just that like one kind of scene that we included at the beginning of this episode, where she's talking about grief. Like I honestly don't think that's enough for Marvel to make WandaVision a good and interesting study on grief, but like I mean some of the premise was just
it does that's why I think it does continue in Doctor Strange, which that's what I'm saying. Like I think that's kind of like a good follow-up to it in certain ways. I think a lot more needs to be explored. She's a complex character, and I think in certain ways Marvel is not doing her character as much justice as I feel like it can be. But it's also like a lot of the problems are in universe things.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's what I actually want to talk about next, because I think like this idea of are her actions justified? That it's like central to so many of these films, right? Like they're obsessed with this idea of like, oh, someone good does something bad, or somebody bad like does something good for a second. Like this is why they do things. Like, is it justified? And as a result, it's also what fans become obsessed with. Is Wanda justified in doing this or that? And I think like taking this idea from disability justice of interdependency is really interesting to me. Like, how do we actually extend our analysis and talk about like why things happen? Like, what are the cogs, the wheels that are turning for the situation to occur, and not sort of like assume that people act on their own, like in a vacuum and like sort of isolated from these other outside forces, right?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. Yeah, it's just I feel like I can like talk about this like for hours, just trying to like figure her out a little bit more, and kind of like where did they go wrong with her, where are they like, you know, a bit more representative in terms of like how, because I don't think, well, I think they messed up not well, I think they've made like mistakes with her. I do think there's potential for something. She's like, I wouldn't say she's the first, actually. I was going to say she's one of the first Marvel characters on screen to deal with mental health, but that is not true because they did that whole thing with Tony. But a lot of the times when I look at like fan sites and stuff, and like, because I'm like a part of like the Marvel fandom, right? And I'm always consuming Marvel content. And a lot of kind of congrats comes to like how Marvel dealt with Tony's kind of PTSD and anxiety and things like that. But I don't really necessarily see some of the same things when they talk about Wanda and like how Marvel dealt with it, obviously because it wasn't dealt with very well.
That's such a good point. I've never thought of that. Like Tony has a whole movie dedicated to that.
And we also like see it, you know, throughout like other movies, like sprinkled through. It's obviously not as expanded on as it is Iron Man like 3 specifically, but that's a compliment. They're like, well, like you really do see kind of like his PTSD, his anxiety that he deals with and that he continues to deal with, and you see a little bit of that like with literally an Endgame when like Steve comes back and he's like, like I'm feeling this immense kind of like whatever, because you said we were gonna fight together, we're gonna do whatever, and I'm now dealing with the loss of like Peter and like my family and like all this stuff. And
yeah, and I think it's like, which hero in the Marvel universe doesn't have PTSD? You know? So I think it's like ultimately interesting that for the men, for like the male characters on the most part, they get moments to kind of like talk about their grief, the kinds of trauma that drive them to do certain things. And it's seen as like sort of a humanizing thing, right? Like they struggle with these things just like everybody else does.
Right.
But
like we
Wanda,
literally see Bucky in a therapy session.
Exactly, right? But with Wanda, it's like, I think because it's connected to her power.
Yeah, it's so connected. It's so connected.
Exactly. Like, so for the men, for the others, it's humanizing. Like their mental illness is humanizing. People have emotions. Who knew? And then for Wanda, like it's takes on the sort of like the trope about mental illness that it's uncontrollable. You can't understand it. It actually dehumanizes her.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, even connected to that, like Agatha literally calls what she harnesses chaos magic. Chaos is often does not have a positive connotation attached to that word, and part of it is that kind of like uncontrollability, that what chaos is something that can't really be restrained in a lot of ways, or it takes a lot to be restrained. And so when you attach that to a character like her, like she's the only one, like Agatha was surprised. She was like a lot of people cannot harness this. And it's like, but solely you can do it, Wanda. Only you. And it's not seen as a positive thing once again. Like she's like, something's amiss. And once again, hate to keep referencing it, but this is explored more in Doctor Strange, this idea of chaos magic and all of that.
Yeah. And just like chaos as opposed to what? Like the very non-chaotic, normative way of living that the rest of us are doing. Like, I don't know if Tony dealt with his like daddy issues and all of his trauma in a non-chaotic way.
Yeah. It's just a lot. I think her character kind of just highlights a lot of hypocrisy in terms of like male superheroes versus the female superheroes, but then you also have physical disability versus like mental psychiatric disabilities, and kind of that whole thing, the differences between. So yeah, those are kind of like our thoughts on Wanda. We have one more episode
where we'll go back to Steve a little bit and we'll tie together the two and talk more about the kind of distinctions or differences that we're starting to bring up. Like how Steve is like super normal or superhuman, and Wanda is kind of like less human because of her disability. What does that mean about disabled minds versus disabled bodies? So we'll see you in part 3, where we'll be talking about the superhero genre in general and bringing together Wanda and Steve.
And talking also about more recent and up and coming examples of disability and superheroes.
Yeah, things to watch out for and things to think about regarding disability and education.
Right. Okay, thanks.